Tēnā koutou katoa. Good evening and welcome to the final interview in our series of Expanding Our Bubbles interviews. This is our fourth week, and now that we're in level 2 and we've all officially kick-started into what we're all referring to as our new normal, we thought it might be a nice place to finish our live interviews. But the good news is, because they've been so popular, we're going to continue with a monthly interview and bring in well-known early childhood education experts to share more about different parts of the field, philosophies and opportunities for all parents, teachers and kaiko to come together and learn a little bit more. Kia ora, I'm Erin Maloney. I'm founding director of Tiny Nation. Tiny Nation is a relatively new early learning provider. We're a home-based provider, but we're really by the sector for the sector, and our real intention is to get out there, partner with other early learning services, engage with families, parents and communities, and really do the mahi around bringing more awareness to key early learning topics, and really, I guess, focus in on care as the curriculum and relationship-based opportunities to come together and learn together. So tonight, I'm really excited to bring to you all Sarah Aiono, who is a director of Longworth Education. Play is the way. We all know this, right? Learning through play is so critically important in our early years, our foundation years. So much happens with early brain development and how everything connects up, and it connects up through play and through relationship. But often it can be kind of misinterpreted, and sometimes it can be a bit confusing, especially for parents, to understand what it all means and, you know, what learning through play actually is. So Sarah's here to take us through her definition of learning through play. Not only does she have an education background as a teacher, she also has a background as a facilitator, as a Ministry of Education accredited facilitator, working alongside teachers in both early childhood education settings and primary school setting. I'll let her share more about the work that she does, but if you just bear with me, I'll bring her in and we'll give her a bit of a welcome. Kia ora, Sarah, welcome.
Kia ora. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're really excited.
Oh, it's nice to be here.
And we're really excited because we've actually had you before in a live workshop, but, you know, pre-COVID, when we could actually have a live workshop in a room with people,
Yes.
and our sector colleagues and our educators, and you gave us a really fascinating insight into learning through play. So we're looking forward to continuing that conversation tonight.
Yeah, no, it was. It seems a lifetime ago now, having actual face-to-face interaction like that. So yeah.
Does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
In the meantime, we're all getting very well used to platforms like this and zooming in and out. But in terms of starting at the very beginning, I've given you a wee intro, and I'm sure there's a lot of people watching this who already know who you are. By the way, if you're watching this, just give us a bit of a kia ora in the comments field so we know who you are and where you're from. And if you've got any questions as we work through, just let us know and we'll see if we can get to them at some point. But in terms of sharing a little bit more about your background and your why, obviously you've been in the academic space. You can talk a little bit more about that in terms of your doctoral research and where that's all at, but also have that really practical base as well. And we're really big on our why at Tiny Nation and passion and forming our purpose in everything that we do. Do you just want to give us a little overview as to how you ended up in this play-based space?
Yeah, well, I guess it's kind of twofold really, with a sort of a professional and personal side to it. So obviously professionally, as you've said, I'm a teacher. I'm a primary teacher trained by trade, and I spent my formative years in education teaching in primary schools across all age ranges. And then I guess really the turning point for me professionally was when I became involved with a project in South Auckland that was set up using some ministry funding in recognition of there being a lot of children who were transient in the area, who would just simply arrive at school and no one would really know where they were from or what learning levels they were at or anything like that. And they presented with some very difficult behaviours and some really quite significant learning needs. A lot of these kids that came to the school that I was at were asked to leave from other schools because of the behaviour that they'd been involved in. And so we took them on and knew that they needed something different. They needed something that would work instead of trying the same old thing that just didn't seem to be working for them. And the school system didn't seem to fit their needs, and we were trying to fit them into the system. So I spent a little bit of time working as a behaviour modification teacher. We ran a program in the classroom which really looked at building children's resiliency, building their social and emotional skill sets. We took less of a focus on the academics because we knew that the wider skills that they needed around just feeling loved at school, feeling like they were worthy, feeling that they were successful, that they could interact with other kids, was more important than whether they got their reading done that night. So that was our big focus. And I share with everyone that it was the best job I ever had. They were the kids that were the hardest to love, but when they loved with everything. So I really took that job and yeah, just gave that my heart, I guess. And we talk a lot about teacher heart, and that was one of those heart jobs. That's probably where I first found play. Because I'd gone through the training system. This is how you are a teacher. This is what you look like. This is what to expect of your kids. This is how a lesson looks. And none of that fitted working with these kids. I'd end up getting chairs thrown, someone punched in the head, spat at, so putting a maths worksheet in front of a kid just wasn't going to fly in that classroom. So that's where we went back to what works with children, which is allowing them to play and using that as sort of the vehicle for learning to happen through, rather than us trying to make them do things that really cause them so much anxiety that they would act out in that way. So that when we talk to teachers about it, we talk about it being a journey, and that was probably the turning point for me that kind of started leading me that way. I then moved into special needs more full-time. I moved out of the classroom and worked as a resource teacher of learning and behaviour. I did some work as a special education advisor with the ministry. I was really interested in kids who didn't fit the box, who were telling us at school by their behaviour they weren't happy. They didn't feel successful at school, they didn't feel they were good enough, and they didn't feel loved. And that was something that I was really quite passionate about, and just questioned a lot with the system around what are we doing for these kids. We talk a lot about underachievement, the tail, all that kind of thing, but what's actually happening in the classroom for these kids. So those were just sort of the ponderings. And then on the flip side to that too, I'm a mum of 3 beautiful kids, and my eldest, he's 21, he's had a very traditional school system, school experience, and by the time we got to year 13 we were all hanging in by the fingernails to get him through to the end of the year, because really he just had enough of school. He was done, and he was just really trying to we were all just trying to hang in there to get him done. And that sort of showed me around learning about that very traditional system, particularly traditional high school that he was in at the time. And then my other 2, my youngest one, he's now 10, but he about 3 or 4 we started to notice that he had potentially some language delay, and he would also have brain going a mile a minute, just all these great ideas. He just saw things differently, he could problem solve differently, blew us away with some of the angle of things he saw in life, but the language was slow to come out, and so he'd get really frustrated. We'd have meltdowns all the time because he couldn't explain what was going on in his head. And as a teacher, I could see very quickly that this was going to become a challenge for a new entrant teacher when he started. And so we decided to delay his start to school, thinking another year might give him some more maturity with his language. And in that time, we ended up having him attend Forest School, Longworth Forest School, and we didn't look back. He hasn't actually been in a traditional classroom since. He spent 3 years in the Forest School, and then we've carried on homeschooling him since. And my daughter, who's our middle child, she's now 13, she went to school, and slowly over the years got more and more insular, less excited and happy about school, and it got to her year 4 and we made the decision to pull her out as well and have her join her brother at Forest School. So we kind of, I guess really my journey has been moving from traditional teaching and the school system and starting to think, actually, does that one fit everyone? And that sort of led me to research and to explore and to think about my own practice around why play, what's so special about play from an educative perspective. That means it's a tool for kids to learn. So yeah, it's as we say, it's a journey, and that's sort of the journey that's led me to where I am now.
What a story.
Yeah, it's been a busy time.
Absolutely. So learning through play, and you would know this, especially in recent years, it's become a real buzz term, right? And it's really thrown around across a lot of early learning services, and also primary schools into those early years. And a lot of services and schools will claim that they have a learning through play philosophy. In your mind, how would you define that? And more importantly, what does learning through play look like when it's done right and in a really authentic way?
Yeah, so I think that there's, we like to describe the varying models or varying interpretations of play-based learning or learning through play a little bit like a continuum. And if we've got sort of 4 areas really, if we have sort of we all understand the traditional teaching model. We've all probably experienced that. And if we have that at sort of one end, that's that sort of chalk and talk model, teachers in charge, everyone sit down, listen to the teacher, do what the teacher says. If we take that model and swing it right the polar opposite, we have what we would know as free play, right? Kids who can go and play, do what they like, the teacher or there's adults that aren't involved and they're left to play to their own devices. Now, that's a lovely way to learn, and free play is very, very important for kids. But what the research shows is that actually that alone isn't necessarily going to improve learning outcomes for children. It's certainly going to help, but it's not actually going to complete the puzzle, if you like, of how we support children to learn. And so what we try and advocate is a much more centered approach between the two, because if we look at, for example, some of the theory for those educators out there that will know people like Vygotsky and the zone of proximal development, which we would have all learnt at Teachers College, that's a really key theory that sits in what we would know as an effective play environment. So where we're looking for opportunities where children who are engaged in play, who are directing their own learning and they are controlling that direction of the learning, they've got the freedom to be able to explore and discover for themselves things that interest them in their play, but at the same time have access to more knowledgeable others, people who can assist them to make meaning or make sense of new things that they come across. Now, that doesn't have to be an adult all the time. That's not necessarily the teacher's role all the time, but we have to know where those more knowledgeable others are. And so what we ask and when we come to look at a play-based environment is, what's the role of the teacher here? What is the teacher doing to promote the learning that's going on in the play? And how are they becoming an authentic learning partner in that process? They're not leading the play, they're not taking over and controlling the play. That's firmly in the hands of children. But how are we helping children to further their own discoveries and learn more things as they play? How are we helping them develop their language as they play? How are we helping them solve problems that maybe they don't necessarily have the skill set to solve at the moment? So it's about, for us, looking at the teacher and looking at how they do that. And it's actually quite a complex way of teaching when done right. And so it does take quite a bit to get your head around, but at the same time we argue that it's the most rewarding way to teach, because you get such lovely feedback from kids who in having that control in their play are developing all these wonderful skills and all these confidences to be able to explore what's interesting to them and explore it to its fullest. So yeah, we want to kind of move away from the pendulum areas as much as possible. I mean, we argue there's times that are very important where we have adult control. You know, the fire drill goes, you need adults in charge to get everyone out. And equally, free play is wonderful. There is research around having children who are able to take themselves away and not feel like they've got the gaze of adults on them all the time and hovering around them. We know that's important too, but we don't want sort of the extremes all the time. We want to try and find the centre where there's lots of lovely learning going on and play and children having that control, but the adults are a partner in that as well.
So I was going to ask you this a little bit later on, but I'll ask you now because it kind of ties in quite nicely. In terms of your doctoral research, and for those of you who don't know, Sarah's been furiously working on completing this over the last few months and is almost
great lockdown project.
Yeah, probably came at the right time for you. You look quite closely at the role of the teacher in terms of that intentional teaching process as a part of that learning through play. And I guess a lot of people probably do kind of in their own minds think of learning through play as being what you describe as free play, where the child is just left to it and they can explore at their own pace. And yes, there are times for that, but that intentional teaching is also really important, right? So what's been your biggest learning through your research in terms of the role of the teacher?
Well, the research itself, we focused on how to support teachers and through professional development to develop practices that we know to be evidence informed. And so one of the things that was really important to us was defining these practices that then we could measure the progress of learning that teachers were involved in the study. So what we looked at is, you know, we combed the international literature, we looked at all these different practices that we would want to see, and we came up with a development of a tool, an observation tool, as part of the research called the Play-Based Learning Observation Tool, or the P-Blot. And the P-Blot is a way that we can walk into any setting and look for evidence of these teaching practices that we know contribute to positive learning outcomes for children as they play. So they don't, this tool doesn't look at children, it looks at the teachers. The children know how to play. We want to know what the teachers are doing to support the play. And so in these practices, there's particularly the largest section of this tool is around intentional teaching approaches. And I guess really for me, what it boiled down to was understanding that as teachers, we have a toolkit, you know. I harbour back to petrol head. I'm a petrol head, so I think of toolkits, right? And I think of in my toolkit, I've got all sorts of tools. I've got tools that I use every day as a teacher, you know, a screwdriver or a spanner or whatever, right? A crescent. And they're just little tools that you just add to the job all the time. So you apply to the play as you're supporting kids. And so those are tools like, for example, praise, redirection, gifting language. You know, they're things that we just do all the time as teachers. But we use them with intent. So whenever we interact with children, we have an intention when we do it. We have, even if it's not necessarily right on the front of our mind at the time, we know that by just giving a little bit more language to a child as they're trying to explain something is growing their language ability. So we have those tools. And then we have more specialised tools that we bring out for when special occasions happen, positive and negative. And so we bring them out and we know exactly what time of the day or what kind of situation to use those tools in. And that's really being an intentional teacher, is saying, okay, I'm making decisions here all the time that will aid the outcomes of my learners. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we're actually going to be in the learning all the time. So, for example, we could see two children having a bit of a conflict over some toys that they want to play with. Our intentional teaching approach would be firstly to decide what skills do those kids have at the moment to solve conflict. Are they quite mature with their conflict resolution skills, or do they have none and it's about to get nasty pretty quickly? You know, and that sort of pre-information helps us decide which tool we're going to choose to solve this conflict. An intentional teacher who knows their children will say, well, they've actually got some good mature conflict resolution skills. I'm actually just going to watch this a bit longer and see if they can solve this for themselves. I'm watching it in case it doesn't, but I'm stepping back out of it because I know the best learning for them right now is to not get involved. And by not getting involved, I'm teaching them. And that's something that we find really hard as teachers to do because we like to be involved. We like to have control, and stepping back and shutting this sometimes is really hard. But we have to be affirmed in our practice to know that by making that decision, we're still teaching. We're being intentional and thinking about the outcomes for our students. So that was something for me is really unpacking that intentional teaching, knowing that there's very clear practices based in evidence that we know when applied in a play-based setting will impact student learning for the positive. And it's just about being very clear what those practices are and focusing in on those and being supported to do that through some good solid PD.
Cool. So when it comes to, I guess, taking this play-based approach and looking at the role of the teacher as well, but more so looking at this thing we call urges for children and how that connects to their learning through play. And the early childhood teachers and educators out there may know what I mean when I say urges, but I know we also have some parents listening. So what would you define urges as being, and how do they connect with this idea of learning through play?
Well, I kind of like to remind adults that we still have these urges. The more technical term for them is schema. So for those that don't know them as urges, then the more academic name is schema. But we have adopted the term urges from our wonderful friends at the Nest here, Kimberly Crisp. And we love how she describes the urges, because I think really if you think about teaching and learning and things that's at a school sector or an early learning sector, we talk about curriculum a lot, and we're by design we've got a curriculum to follow, and that curriculum is often focused on set outcomes that we want or certain domains or areas that we're looking for, and that curriculum helps us as adults to be reminded about the things that we know to be useful for children to help them develop. But children don't come into the setting or the school setting with the curriculum in mind. They don't think, oh, today I think I might develop some more well-being, so I'm going to go and be a good friend today. They don't think intentionally like that. They don't think, for example, at school level, I really don't know enough about what lives in the garden, so today I'm going to go and investigate that a little bit and learn a bit more about science. They just don't think like that. What happens is that they engage in things that make them feel good. And we all have these things in us, these ways of thinking, these patterns of thinking that we don't even realize we're doing until someone points it out. So if you've got children, for example, who love to build things, right? Build with Lego or cut cardboard up and stick it together and build models with it. If they like to mix potions, they get all the stuff out of the pantry and mix a potion. You know, that's all a construction urge. That's something that they like to put things together and see what happens, or build something. Kids who love to build forts and huts, that's an enclosure urge. Rolling down a hill, you know, you get to the top of the hill and they sit there and suddenly they all roll down. They do that not because they say, gosh, I've got a bit of a rotation urge, I better get that out of my system and roll down the hill. They just go, whoa, this feels good, you know, and the joy that comes from it. And we know that urges are actually this biological wiring that help us wire up our brain, because they help us explore the world through play, through these urges. So we have there's a wide variety of them. But if we think about it from an adult perspective, we continue to do this, but we probably are a little bit more socially aware. So we don't necessarily do it, you know, literally go and roll down a hill. Some of us would, but more would probably be a little bit shy about doing that around other people. But there's certainly things that we still explore as adults that would be our urge. One of the ones that I share with teachers a lot is, how many of you like to hang out the washing a certain way? You know, and if you left someone else to hang it out and it wasn't quite done right, would that bother you? And we have a lot of people that say, oh, actually, that would really bother me. Well, that's an ordering urge. there's a lot of educators that have ordering urges. They have to in a classroom. So, you know, to be able to have things in a certain order is just something that makes us biologically feel better. And for many of those things give us joy. So urges are really important to recognise, because that actually forms the foundation for how we recognise our children's interests in their play, and then how we learn to respond. So that idea of notice, recognise and respond, noticing what children are doing, recognising what urge it might be, or several urges it might be within their play, and then that gives us sort of some assessment data, if you like, some information on how we're going to respond as adults to support that play. We might make sure that there's some more resources that they can use to fully explore that urge until they don't need to anymore. So it's a really critical piece of information for educators and for parents, so that they understand how their children are making sense of the world through their urges.
And when you say making sense of the world, that probably leads us into the next question, which is, obviously we've moved into level 2 now as a part of our COVID response. As I mentioned at the start, we're trying to forge our way through into the new normal. It comes with lots of uncertainty. A lot of the educators and teachers listening tonight would have just started back this Monday and still be partway through their first week of care resuming. And for a lot of us, we've been really conscious, I suppose, of that settling, that transition phase, and how to support our tiny learners with everything that goes with that, and all of the big feelings that they're feeling at the moment. And obviously it's a temperament thing, and Serena's made a really good point in the comments around learning styles and temperaments being really, really vital in considering the way that we connect with all individual children. And I actually reached out to you, Sarah, probably a week or so ago, because we were putting together a resource for our educators around this whole idea of life after lockdown and what it looks like, and how to focus on these really critical settling and transition moments. And play is actually an incredibly important part of that when it comes to allowing our children to make sense of this new world and this new normal that we find ourselves in. And you shared some really great resources with me from the International Play Association around that. Can you share a little bit more about the role that play takes in this kind of environment as we deal with something as big as a worldwide pandemic?
Well, I think in a nutshell, play is a great stress release, you know, and right now we want children to not experience any more stress than they need to. I know that that's hard at times when there is change or there's stress at home and that sort of thing, but we do want to try and mitigate that exposure to stress as much as possible. And so play is literally medicine for it, if we like, because of the way that our brains respond when we're engaged in play. We know that, for example, 2018, the American Academy of Pediatrics, or Pediatricians, I should say, released a huge report around play, and they really advocate the long and sustained exposure to play for children for as long as possible, not just till 5, not just till 8, you know, up to adulthood, because it really is the way that we learn cognitively, we develop physically, but also in terms of emotional regulation and development, and our social skills as well. So it's the best bang for buck. And I guess really there's been a traditional viewpoint around helping children manage change in the past, which has been to get them into a routine, to provide them with some structure and you know, nail them down and just almost pretend nothing's happened, you know. And actually what it is that we actually need to foster safe and secure and caring relationships, and play enables us to do that, because it's the language of children. By coming in alongside them and having them take their lead in the play, having them control what's happening in the play, but you being alongside is to be able to have them have some control, you know, particularly in a time where they don't have a lot of control, where adults are probably, for many of our families, they'll be worried about what's happening with their financial status, their jobs. You know, mum and dad will be home more often than what they're used to, different routines in place, all those sorts of things. So just for a little while in play, they get to say what happens. It's their world. And that's probably one of the most critical things at the moment, is to give them that time and for us to be with them rather than them be with us. So that's where play is so critical. And I think too, there has been a lot of wonderful I guess sort of opposing arguments around play and social distancing and cleaning of equipment, and should they be messy play and all that sort of thing. I think it does come down to common sense, and we know that first and foremost children need to feel loved, and they need to feel that they've got a secure attachment. And if you've got children in your care, then obviously, there's regulations we have to follow, but above and beyond those, it's about making sure they feel secure and attached and cared for, and play is the way that we can do that most authentically. Yeah.
Cool. So if you had a child in your care who, as a part of this whole transition process was, I guess, manifesting their emotions in quite an aggressive way through play, as a way to, I guess, share their story and say a little bit more about what they're feeling and what they're going through, how would you respond to that as a parent or as a teacher?
I think, well, it depends on the age of the child and what skills they've got, I guess, for communicating. But I think first and foremost, we have to look at what the behaviour is communicating, and behaviour is communication, whether it's a verbal behaviour or physical behaviour, they're communicating. And particularly children who have anxiety won't come out and tell you they're worried necessarily. It might look like a meltdown. And so it's about trying to translate what it is that's the worry for them. What helps too is understanding generally what urges they might have in their play, what types of play. So there's also this thing called functional types of play, which many people will know as things like fantasy play, construction, there's physical play, there's sort of these types. But the thing about those types of play is it's not necessarily what they're doing, but what they get from what they're doing. So for some kids who maybe are feeling quite anxious and it's manifesting as sort of aggressive behaviour, physical play might be the thing for them. Getting outside in nature might be something that helps them just recenter a little bit. And so recognising that might be a need for them and providing that for them within a safe space. But also working with children, particularly around their communication. And you can start very young with this by simply recognising or giving them language around emotion and saying to them, I can see that you're going red in the face and you're really huffing and puffing at the moment. I think you might be feeling angry, and I'm wondering what that might be about. And so starting to give them some language around the emotion that they're feeling, and that's sort of the building blocks of developing emotional literacy, and then helping them manage that and learning about self-regulation. And these are all the reasons why play is so valuable, because it gives us this menu to be able to go, this is something that is a skill that you're learning through the process of play, is self-regulation. This is something else you're learning, emotional literacy. This is problem solving, this is sharing. These are all these things that come out as a result of children engaging in play. So if it's children that are really not coping very well and they're quite physical and quite aggressive, then actually we need to get them moving. We need to get them outside in nature as much as possible. Anger and aggression is an energy. We have to kind of burn it off so that then we can get to a place of calm neurologically where we're able to hear. And when we're able to hear, then we can start that process of giving them some tools around how to manage it differently next time and to recognise what it might be. So, yeah.
Cool. So a lot of what you're talking about, I guess we would refer to as being soft skills.
Yes.
And we had Amanda Fleming on last week who is a bit of a guru in the personal development space around emotional intelligence and fostering, personally skills like resilience and problem solving and teamwork and all of those things that we really aspire our children to have as they grow into their own people and as they grow older. So I guess that leads us into that transition to school space, which is an incredibly important space for children and for parents. I'm in that space at the moment. My 5-year-old just started school on Monday. And when it comes to, I guess, teachers at early learning services who will proudly tell you that, children at their services know their ABCs and their 1, 2, 3s and can write their name before they go to school. What would you say to those teachers and to parents who think that that is kind of the tick, yep, he can do that, tick, yep, no nailing that, tick, yep, he's ready?
There is an enormous amount of evidence that knowing those skills early does not lead to good outcomes later academically. It makes no difference. I'm
feeling a huge amount of relief right now.
the international literature is quite clear in that. Now, we're talking about typically developing children. Obviously, if there are children who are atypical, who perhaps we're starting to suspect that there's some learning needs, or perhaps are well advanced of where they are developmentally, then there's a different aspect to that. But we're generally talking about kids who are typically moving through their stages of learning quite usually, and cause no major concern either way. What the research shows is that whether you're an early reader or a late reader, most children catch up with each other between the ages of 10 to 12. But what they do show is that often those children who engage in early learning when they're not quite ready for it, we're not necessarily saying all children shouldn't read until a certain age later. We're not about that. What we're saying is children will be ready to read when they're ready to read. There's indicators for that. If we push that too early, we're actually limiting them in developing other skills, because that's what we're focusing on. We're kind of hammering into the literacy or the numeracy, and we're not actually allowing them to develop other skills that are far more important, or even skipping some baseline skills or foundation skills that they're going to need later on. One of the wonderful international advocates of players is Dr. Peter Gray, and he's, for those of you that know him, he wrote a book called Free to Learn, and it's a beautiful book to read about learning. And he, in an interview recently, said that if we think about it in life, we could actually technically get through life without learning to read or write. It's pretty hard, and it's certainly much easier to be able to read or write in life. That's definitely a useful tool to have, but it would be even harder if we weren't nice people and we weren't able to get on with people. That would make it even harder. And so the early years are about developing dispositions for learning, being able to develop these skills that help us connect with other people, to be able to develop ourselves and our identity as a learner, our confidence as a person, how we get on with other people, how we manage ourselves. All those things, they sort of fall under this descriptor of what's called executive function skills, and they're actually a part of the brain that's developed right up in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, and they're skills now that neuroscientists are indicating are better to have than test scores, better than than a high IQ. They're better indicators overall of success in life, because we know that our kids in the future, well, we don't know what jobs they're going to have. We don't know what the workforce is going to look like, but we know that these executive function skills are these skills that will help them to transition through life no matter what happens to them. We know that they're also skills that build good resiliency around mental health, which we know is a key ingredient now in well-being. So that's what we focus on in the early years, is building that really solid foundation, which comes back to how we get along with others, how we manage ourselves, how we organise ourselves. So when kids start school, what I know new entrant teachers are asking for is that children are able to know how to manage themselves, how to listen, how to follow some instructions, how to be kind to other people, and all those basic things. Of course, if they know a couple of letters and they know how to write their name or recognise their name, I mean, that's not going to hurt them. But we don't want that to be the absolute focus as an indicator of readiness for school. It's much more about the whole child than literacy and numeracy.
Yeah, great. And that's so refreshing to hear. I think sometimes as a parent, you can get caught up in that academic race, I suppose, so to speak, and those developmental milestones. Yeah. And we've talked a lot about it through lockdown, as parents have been kind of succumbed into that teacher role and home learning and everything that involves. And for every parent, that's been so different. And Judy Hunter, our child mental health specialist we had on a couple of weeks ago, talked about it as, lockdown's it's not about a productivity contest. It's not about how much you can get through of your routine and your learning through home planner. It's about making sure that your children are feeling safe and settled and have that environment to kind of thrive at home. And even if you don't get to any of it, then that's enough right now.
Well, and I think it's also really important to trust that children are natural learners. They don't sit there and go, someone teach me, they don't allow themselves to be bored. That's often why we have misbehaviour, because often misbehaviour is because kids are bored and they're trying to entertain their brains and in the process learn something. So it's actually being reassured that children will learn, and actually they'll learn what they need to learn in that moment, or they'll learn what they're interested in. And because they're doing it, because they're interested in it, it's more likely to stick. And that level of engagement is higher, which means that they'll remember it and let it sink in. And often what happens is that we try and put our agenda on them. We think, well, they've got to learn this now, and they're not ready for it. So no matter what we do, it's not going to stick. So it's important to almost use that to our advantage and go, right, well, what is it they're interested in? And let's do more of that, and that will stick more. And when they're ready to learn some other stuff, then we'll do that. And it is really, really important to understand, though, that the evidence is quite compelling that if we force kids to do things when they're not ready to do them, then it's actually probably more damaging developmentally than if we don't do that. So there's a lot of literature around it now. So parents need to just be trusting that their children will be learning nevertheless.
Yeah, and that's really good, because we've just had a comment from Anne who said there is also a lot of comparison made between parents, and social pressure means that some parents feel that they've failed their child if they can't do these academic things when they start school or when their peers are naturally doing them.
Yeah, and my challenge is, my measure as a parent is that I've got a child who is going to be able to cope in the world. We have a lot of teachers who have commented that they're worried about children at year 11, 12, 13 who are so focused on trying and getting these high grades in their exams that they almost get to a point of burnout. And then when they get out into university or out into the workforce, they have got no clue about adult life, and they have an absolute meltdown because they just don't know what to do next. And they've been so focused on trying to get these grades that they don't know how to exist in the real world. And so for us, it's about going, well, what is it that we want for our children as successful adults? Well, a part of it is obviously to be in a job that provides them perhaps some financial security and some happiness, but actually we want them to be good people who can function in society, be good citizens in society, and get along with other people. And if they're doing that, then they're going to be able to contribute.
Totally.
Yeah.
So in terms of that play context, when you look at all of that, and like you say, our aspirations for our children, and you go right back to what play's all about, and imagination is such a critical part of it. And I know as adults, we often feel like sometimes that gets pushed to the side as we kind of crack on with our to-do lists, and we don't have as much time for it. But like you say, we have our urges too. When it comes to that imagination, you've talked before, and I found this really fascinating last time I heard you speak, about how there is a direct link between imagination and science.
Yeah.
Can you just elaborate on that a little bit more for us?
Yeah, so I guess really imagination is the start of scientific thinking. Because while the science research or science investigative processes are what we would call really empirical, so there's definitely a very rigid structure to moving through a scientific experiment. I'm sure that people who are in the middle of trying to find a vaccine for COVID right now have got all these protocols they've got to follow, and double-blind tests, and all this stuff around being a scientist. But if you peel all that back and you go right back to the start, actually scientific investigation is about wondering, and it's about having some imagination for what could be, or what if, or I wonder what would happen, and that hypothesizing. And so we need to be able to be imaginative, to think outside the box. And science is about trying to think outside the box, or trying to test something that someone else hasn't done before. And so by having our children engage in play, they're actually being young scientists. You know, when they're in the garden and they're mixing water and mud, they're saying, I wonder what would happen if I put water with mud. You know, perhaps not quite as literally as that, but they're curious. And what we want to do with play is develop curiosity, wonderment, this desire to explore, and play gives us that. So imagination is probably one of the most important aspects of play, is being able to enter into a different world, to be able to think in a different way. It all builds, again, those executive function skills that our young children need in adulthood.
Awesome.
Yeah.
We've now cracked the 45-minute mark, so those are all the kind of official questions I have for you, and I've seen a few questions coming up in the comments field. So if anyone out there has any burning questions that they want some answers to around all things play related, just pop them in the feed as we keep chatting. Kendall has just asked, what are your thoughts on children starting school at 6? And what do you see as being the advantages or disadvantages of that?
Well, I don't actually have necessarily a age for children to start school. I'd like to look at it more in terms of developmental readiness, and I think it's really important that we don't necessarily look at children at a chronological age level. I know it's hard when that's how our system is organised, but this is certainly something that we keep challenging teachers on all the time, is that you might have a 6-year-old in front of you, but from their cognitive ability, from their physical ability and so on, are they 6 or are they, you know, either side of that? Where are they sitting? We do know from the research that generally children are not ready to engage in more formal learning until they're sort of 7, 8. But in saying that, there are children, for example, my daughter was ready at 4 to learn to read. We couldn't get her to put a book down. And so we weren't about to stop her and say, well, no, you have to wait till you're 7 or 8, because she was ready to go. My son, however, couldn't have cared less, and probably wouldn't have cared until, you know, much later, had he not been surrounded by lots of books anyway. So I think it really comes down to what's right for the child. We know legally in New Zealand you don't have to start school officially until you're 6. This is where we really would love to see more and more schools, particularly in the junior end, but every year level at school, incorporate play, because play provides that transition, and we know that the early years, certainly in the international research, is from 3 to 8. So when we look at all the benefits of play, it's incorporating that age band of 3 to 8. So if children are starting school, we would like to see them moving from a early learning setting that you know, learn through play, into a school setting that has similar you know, expectations of their kids around the learning structure and learning through play. If you can do that, then no matter the age, if that's the transition, then that's developmentally appropriate. If they are starting age 6 and they're jumping straight into a very formalised program, and developmentally they're not ready for it, then there would be more disadvantages than advantages in that respect. So yeah, it's by the child, but ideally they need to be going into a setting that has play as the core activity all day, every day, as they move into the school setting.
Nice. And I think that might be it so far, but just while we're waiting for anyone who might have anything else left, do you just want to take us through, just finally, if there are people out there that want to know a bit more about you, about the work that you do through Longworth Education? You mentioned the Forest School at the start. Do you just want to give a little brief overview of Longworth Education, and I guess the intention there, and any work that you're doing in an ongoing kind of space that people can access?
Yeah, so Longworth Education started out of a discussion I had with my mum and myself. My mum was the one who started Longworth Forest School, and she was very passionate as a primary teacher around having children learning through play outside all day, and these were for children who were age 5 and 6, who were children who whose parents had decided that they were going to delay their start to school, and they wanted them to learn through play in an outdoor context. Those children continued to do their reading and their writing and their maths as they would have done at school, but for the rest of the time they were involved in play outside. So she was sort of fostering that, and at the same time I was starting on my research, and as an RTLB starting to get a little bit despondent around the school system and national standards, and it becoming quite a clinical boxed in approach at school, and certainly not developmentally responsive. And so we kind of got together and decided that we would run some professional development for teachers and share what we knew and our passion for it, and it just grew. And so we now have 9 people that work with us around the country who are absolute fantastic advocates for play. They're very specialised in their knowledge and their skill around play, and we present professional development workshops right up until lockdown, and now we've become very, very clever, and we now present them as webinars. So we're running our webinars all through May and June, right, around the topics that we talk about around play, the role of the teacher, timetabling for play, play invitations and literacy in play and things like that. So that's our one aspect, and then we work also in school settings and some early years settings where we come in and we use a professional development model where we work alongside the teacher to develop their practice in play, and use things like the P block that I mentioned to identify areas of practice that teachers would like to work on further. So that's what we do, and we're right around the country doing it. We're all over the show.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you. I've just got one more question from Caroline. I have little learners who love their imaginary play-based day, but also just love to write, look at letter formation, numbers, etc. Should I just keep on extending as I am doing daily? I foster creativity and imagination.
If they like doing it, do it.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, it sounds like that they're just curious about making marks on paper. That's all great pre-literacy skills. I wouldn't necessarily be giving them any formal instruction around it. I would just be giving them the joy of making marks. I'd be supporting them to develop their identity as writers. This is something that's really, really critical that we see a lot of, as we see children disengage from writing really early on because they are put into a system where it's quite instructional, and they see writing in only one form. So particularly in the school setting, traditionally we're going to sit down and we're going to write a story. You draw your picture, you write a story, we've done our writing. When actually we want children to understand that writing is communication, and that we're all good writers, and writing is about making marks, particularly for our littlies. So if your focus is not necessarily on letter formation, but it's more around them being a writer and them having a message to share with people, then that's going to create that disposition that will lead them into being confident writers in their school years. So we want to be able to foster a joy of writing, which means that we let them write and we let them have fun with it, and we let them understand that they're communicating a message. Those are all the purposes for writing. So yeah.
Awesome. Jeanne's just also mentioned that she'd love to have the opportunity to do an online PD webinar with you, Sarah. So there you go. Lovely place. So check out Longworth Education if you haven't already. Sarah is one of our partners here at Tiny Nation, and we've got some exciting things happening behind the scenes that we're hoping to share with you a little bit later on in the year. And Sarah is going to continue to do some work with us and with our educators and with our community. And we're also going to look at what we can do more widely in the early learning sector as well. So stay tuned. Sarah's a wealth of knowledge. We're really excited to have her on board as a partner. And I just want to say a big thank you, Sarah, for joining us tonight and sharing a little bit more about you and about your passion for play.
Oh, you're welcome. It's I could talk all night.
For a good combo.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks everyone who's joined us tonight. It's been epic doing this Expanding Our Bubbles series. We've really enjoyed having you all along for the ride. Hopefully you found it useful. All of our live interviews are on our Facebook page under our live tab, so you can access them at any time. And we'll look forward to continuing to share more with you in the coming months. Thanks again, Sarah.
Thank you. See ya.
See you later all. Bye.